So as I said, this is our panel. Rebekah and I'll just repeat it for those who just came in. Rebekah and I have had a lot of fun getting to know each other for the first time at this conference in order to prepare this. And we actually want to start with an introduction and an experience that comes from both of our different, but in some ways amazingly similar backgrounds. And Rebekah's going to start.
Okay. So my name is Rebekah Skeete, and I live in Nova Scotia, and I'm the director of 8 YMCA Nova Scotia Works locations. But actually, when I get into my conversation today, I'm actually going to have on a different hat. In Nova Scotia, we have a certification process for career development practitioners, and I'm the lead assessor for that process. So when I talk about interviewing and the interviewing process that we use, I'm going to be talking about that process with the Nova Scotia Career Development Association. And this is my time, and she's going to keep me on time. So years ago, like probably at least 15 years ago, Nova Scotia talked about having a voluntary certification process for people that were career practitioners. And I've been on that committee. I say 10 years, but I think I've been saying 10 years for like at least 5, so it might have been even longer. So we knew that we wanted to kind of have, we wanted our profession to be recognized for career development practitioners. So there was we went around the province to ask career practitioners if we had some sort of a process, what would you want that to look like? And they wanted a competency-based process. So there's some provinces that may look at a combination of education and experience, or you may need a master's degree. In Nova Scotia, it's a competency-based process, and there's 3 different tools that we use in order for someone to become certified. So the Nova Scotia Career Development Association received funding, and Phil Mondor was hired to develop that process. So there's a multiple choice exam, so it's 80 questions. There's a work experience package, so it's kind of like a glorified resume or application where they identify all their work experience. And then there's a structured interview. So our structured interview, people were trained to be able to use this tool to interview candidates. So when we have people that do the interviews, they're not allowed to move from the script at all. So right from the very beginning, when you hit that recording, and everything you say to that individual is scripted. The interviews are done over the phone. So we don't do them in person. They're done over the phone, and they're also recorded because they're actually there's 2 listens to each interview. So we have the primary assessor who will listen for the first interview, and they're taking notes, and they're checking things off, some yeses and some nos, and then they score it independently. And then that tool is sent into the registrar, and he'll take that recording and send it off to a second assessor who will also listen to it and score it independently. And then if they both pass the individual, then they would move on to the next step. Even when the interviewers when they're interviewing with their candidate, they're not allowed to paraphrase. They're not allowed to give feedback, so they're not allowed to give any type of information. They read a script and they say exactly what their role is. If the candidate goes off track, they can sometimes stop and repeat the question or repeat part of the question, but they're not allowed to paraphrase. They're not allowed to say, oh, you're doing a good job. Oh, yeah, no, keep going. Yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And that's probably one of the hardest things that people have on both ends, right? Because sometimes you want that feedback, and if you're talking and you're not hearing anything, you're not even hearing a and you can't see the person because there's no nodding. It makes it kind of awkward for some people. Some of the feedback that people say afterwards is just like that was horrible. Like the interview process was horrible. But there's a number of reasons why we do it like that. We want to make sure that everyone hears the question the same way, right? And everyone's getting the exact same information. So part of that is part of the quality assurance piece, right? We do have, on our tool, there's a number of things, instructions for the assessor prior to, and part of that is even a review of different types of biases so that they can review some of the biases, because there could be like a strictness bias where you have one assessor that's marking really strict, and then you have another assessor sometimes that might mark that they're a little bit more lenient. By having the 2 people mark them independently, plus it's recorded, if there's ever an issue, it actually goes to a third assessor. Actually, that's usually when I get them, if there's ever an issue between two of the evaluations. So the assessors are encouraged to read over their biases, because even though we try to eliminate some of the biases, like, okay, you don't have the body language and this and that, we all know that biases are still at play all the time. So that's why they have those statements there, so that they can kind of look at them and review those biases ahead of time to be mindful of them.
You keep going.
Okay. So, I know I said I'd talk really fast. I'm going to get you guys to do a quick little activity. So, and you need 2 people. So you need 2, you have to get a person next to you, and just the 2 of you have to go back to back. So just take your chair and turn them and go back to back. And if you have to get up and move, you can get up and move. How are we for time?
You're fine. You're only 5 minutes in.
Oh, okay.
So then at the end of this, you can still introduce all the different things you've done in your life.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, great.
Told you I talk fast.
Yeah. Are we lined up here?
Does everybody have a partner?
Oh, I'll be a partner over here.
Okay.
Except you don't want to mic me on this one.
Oh.
Can you turn off my mic while I partner up with somebody?
So one person is going to be the interviewer or the listener, and the other person is going to talk. And I'm going to time you, and I'm going to give you the topic. So the person that's listening, you're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to turn and look at the person. So figure out who's going to speak. Does everyone know who's going to speak? I'm going to time this. Stop what? And the topic? And I'm going to time it. The topic is pizza. Go.
What is it?
Pizza.
What, that's the topic?
Pizza. Okay, that's time. That's time. Oops, stop. So, I know there's a lot of people in the room, so it was really loud, because normally if you're sitting like, a lot of people were like this, and I'm like, no, you can see them. You're not supposed to look at them, but you almost had to do that to hear them, so I understand that. But I did notice sometimes there were 2 people talking. So, yeah, some people were talking. There was 2 people talking. And they probably weren't talking about pizza. It could have been, I don't know. So for the people that were listening, what was that like?
Oh, I wanted to so add something.
Yeah, like the guts going, oh, I could say something like that.
And what was that like for the people that were talking?
We are rambling.
Did you? But what was that like when you were rambling? Did you find it hard to keep talking about?
He even said, how long do I have to do this for?
Yeah, so for the people that were rambling, it was kind of weird, because you're talking, you're like, okay, I don't know what else to say. I'm just going to say, do I have to keep talking? And you're not giving any feedback. So, and then the people that are listening want to give feedback and say, oh, no, that's great. Oh, yeah. And you want to even compare notes sometimes. Like, oh, yeah, I like pizza. My grandkids like pizza, too. You want to kind of join in on the conversation. So with a structured interview, there's none of that, right? So when you're interviewing, even though if you're doing the interview, you may want to say, oh, good job, and yeah, you're on the right path. But we can't, because it's part of the RPL process that we use.
Oh, really?
Okay.
So the interviewees know this ahead of time?
Yes. Right? Yeah. We usually give them a statement before, and they read a very a scripted statement. As the assessor, I cannot give you feedback. I should have brought the part to read ahead of time.
Do they know how long they have to answer each question time, so they can judge, when the time is up or when they set it up?
They have up to 2 hours.
No, for each question.
There's kind of guesstimates, but they have up to 2 hours to do the whole interview. So they know that there's 5 sections, and there's some behavioral questions and there's situational questions. And they are told there's 5 sections that they'll be looking at. And the assessor usually does let them know how things are moving along. Like, okay, we're going to move to the next section. We're moving on to the next session. But if you had, I haven't seen very many interviews that went the full 2 hours. Those ones are painful, but equally important.
What do they normally run?
Probably about an hour and 15-ish, maybe an hour and a half. And then also, because it's recorded, depending on the assessor, the initial assessor may want to go back and listen to the recording as well. Because I know there's lots of times if I'm listening, and I'll write down the time when a new question starts of the recording, and then I'll go back. And if I'm not sure if I heard something again, I'll go back again to listen very carefully, and I'm all over the document when I'm using it, because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So even though in our tool, there's section 1 might be on a certain type of questions, they may say something in section 5 that is applicable to section 1, so we're allowed to kind of go back as long as it's demonstrated in the interview, if one of the competencies are demonstrated in the interview.
How many questions altogether?
5 sections, and each section has between 3 and 4 questions. So there's usually one situational, 1 or 2 situationals, and then 1 or 2 behavioral. It's 1 or 2 behavioral, 1 or 2 situational. And it's all around, we have a Nova Scotia profile for career practitioners, so it's all based on that occupational profile.
Let's hear a little bit more about your background, and then we'll switch.
So, a little bit more about me. So I work at the YMCA, and I've been there for 18 years, over 18 years actually, and I'm the director of our employment services. So prior to that, you guys won't think I'm this old, but prior to that I worked at community services as the youth employment counselor, and before that I worked at the old Canada Employment Center before it turned into HRDC. So, and in all honesty, I started there when I was in high school. So it was a summer job, and then I stayed there for 5 years, and I went to community services, and then I've been with the Y. So I worked in the 2 level of government and community, and I really enjoy working in community. So although I worked all those, since forever, I also have 3 degrees. So I have a master's degree in social work. So I do a bunch of other things on the side with my social work degree. So I'm actually a private practice social worker. So I do some other things in some of the institutions. So I go into some of the jails and I run some programs with some of the inmates. So I have one starting at the Women's Institution in a couple weeks. And I also work with kids with behavioral problems or that maybe have live with different disabilities. And I'm saying that I haven't done that in a long time, but I actually got a text message at lunchtime asking me to work with someone on Sunday. So I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll do it. I think that's it. Okay. Oh, the lead assessor for the Ns Cda. So the whole that whole certification process, I've been involved in that. I keep saying 10 years, but it probably has been longer. And I also do a number of training for the Ns Cda. So when we have new assessors come in, I actually do the training on the RPL piece and on how to use the actual tool. So.
Can I just ask a question? When do you sleep?
I'm going to sleep really good tonight.
High energy, I think that's your secret.
Yeah, but I like to do things too, like I like to travel, and I do like when I have downtime. I watch a lot of movies and a lot of TV, and people can't believe the number of series that I watch because they don't think I have the time, but I'm pretty sure I did my master's in front of the TV, like watching movies and like this, because I can work just about anywhere and do a couple of things. Yeah, I don't expect anybody to work the way that I work.
This question is actually for Mandy. How do you find it different, the interviewing skills or the interviewing when she can talk versus...
That is our actual learning outcome, and we're about to get there.
Isn't it really interesting?
Yep, it is interesting.
How you are supposed to be active listener and make sure you have some interaction.
Yeah. That's exactly why we're here. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so this is my 15 minutes. Rebekah and I found out that we had a lot in common, and yet we're doing 2 very, very different, in fact, 2 polar opposite ways of interviewing. And we're both involved in this workshop on interviewing skills, which we noticed actually is not listed here. So we're happy that so many people are interested in this in terms of skills of PLAR advisors. So my background, I also worked in a prison doing therapeutic work with lifers. My background started out in psychiatric nursing, which I left and quit completely. Trained as a psychotherapist, then only worked in the community, just doing political activism, mostly with rape survivors. Eventually came to George Brown, and I coordinate a program called the Assaulted Women and Children's Counselor Advocate Program. That program is really unique, and it needed to be accessible to quite a wide variety of students wanting to come to it. Lots of them are mature. Lots of them have had extensive education or experience or life experience in the past, and we needed to figure out a way for them to enter the program using an assessment of their prior learning. So we started doing this quite a long time ago, kind of just went forward and did it. Thanks to FNTI in the early 2000s, our whole program became trained in doing prior learning so that we could develop a plan just for our program. And this learning outcome for this training has to do with bias. It has to do with how do we manage bias, because those direct skills that we use, and we're going to do an exercise on direct skills, either we are able to manage our biases directly in relationship, or we have no relationship. And there's pros and cons for both methods if we're really going to address our biases. My background has been as a relational practice practitioner. So I've also done quite a lot of organizational development in organizations to increase a culture in which harassment does not thrive, by increasing our relational practice skills. And relational practice, if you just wanted to kind of Google it or look for it, you could look at the work of relational cultural practice by Judith. Judith Lewis Herman uses it, but I would say Judith Jordan. And the Wellesley Center, the Wellesley Institute is completely focused in Massachusetts on developing relational practice in both counseling relationships and workplace relationships. Joyce Fletcher is somebody who wrote a book on doing research on relational practice skills in the workplace. And just to give you an example, it's really about taking our core ideas of respect, which is hard to measure. And I think actually that was spoken about this morning, the idea that we think we're going to be respectful, but how do we know we're respectful? If we think that we're being transparent, how do we know that we're transparent? How do we know that we are inviting in a curious way somebody's self in our interview, unless we get feedback? And some of that feedback is going to be the way we are with people, the way we present ourselves with people, and the tone we use. So if you're doing let's say you were doing a 360 in your workplace of employment, and you used a relational practice scale, the question would not be, I freely offer information to help others. It would be, I give information to others in a way that does not make them feel diminished. So it actually gets at the belief behind the skill. So if I believe that I'm giving information to somebody who is deficit and I'm filling up a gap, I will follow that with a way of giving that information that gives that message. What I want to do is give information to someone where I believe that they wish to be. I love that quote this morning. And I'm offering them information in a relational way because I, as a person, am connected to them, and I'm offering them something that I believe is just further enhancing their already wonderful self. So that's what relational practice is all about. So we've been working hard to make sure that although we teach it in the program, we teach it in the context of doing anti-oppression and anti-racism work. And because our program is very, very focused on taking an anti-oppression, making our relationships with the people we work with from an anti-oppression standpoint, our prior learning assessment interviews include some exploration of that person's prior learning about the skills and knowledge in working in that way. And when we do our interviews, we need to use ourselves, because if I'm having a conversation with somebody else, my own social location is present in the conversation. There's no way I can disappear my white privilege, my middle class privilege, my cisgendered, working to a degree first generation working class background, and being a lesbian. Some of those things are a place of privilege and some of those places are not. My relationship with someone is, I can either try to completely disappear it, which is one method, or I can make it present. But I can't be in the middle. I can't be present, I can't have those things present and then try to ignore them. So it's either, for us, it's one way or the other. So our relational interviews include my self-disclosure in order to have a conversation And we would say that an interview is a conversation, not a challenge or an interrogation, but a conversation, which allows that person to unfold as best as possible so that we can explore more what their background is. In terms of those micro skills, you guys still use your handout, but anyway, we talked about micro skills, and which are first, of course, listening. We talked about that this morning, listening, which is clearly, definitely a part of the same interview that you're doing. Once you're looking at that recording and looking at what that person's done, a lot of listening has to go into really thinking about what that person says. In our case, we're working face-to-face, and so we would be using absolutely open questions, but still minimal questions. I know if you do interview and counseling work with people, you know that a question speeds up the interview, and it puts the energy on the other person in a way that can be uncomfortable for them. So you want your questions to be open, absolutely open. So, example of an open question? Anybody?
Tell me about yourself.
Tell me about yourself, that's open. Yeah, another one?
Tell me more why you're interested in that.
Yep, okay. Now, what if I said something like, I interviewed, my job was supervising some of the junior accountants in my business, and I did that for 5 years. What open question might you use in response to that?
Tell me more.
Tell me more about that. Okay. And the closed question would be,
You like that or not? Yeah.
yes. Okay, good. Everyone knows the difference between an open and closed question.
Yes, no.
Okay. Now, the other one would be reflection, which I'm not sure we always use enough of, because reflection can really, and a reflection and a pause can also allow for a fair amount of unfolding. So a reflection, and we're just going to reflect content for now. So let's say I say, so I supervised several of the junior accountants in my organization, and you could reflect by saying,
What kind of what would that entail?
that's an open question.
That must have been, I can't think of an adjective, but that must have been something. Say again about the accounting piece, because I wasn't paying attention.
So I was supervising several of the junior accountants in my organization.
Do you enjoy that work?
That's a closed question.
Did you say hi?
It's hard, but you, pardon?
What do you enjoy about that work?
But is a reflection not a question? Is a reflection more of a statement about, well, that must have been a really interesting experience, or I don't know, something that leads them to.
I would say junior accountant. Who are they?
That's a you've done a bit of reflection and you've followed with an open question. Nicely done.
I would reflect, like, seems like you had a lot of responsibilities
Yep. And you want to use a little bit of what I said. So junior accountants for 5 years, it sounds like that was a lot of responsibility. So reflection is when you take something that somebody says, not parroting what they say, but take something and then sort of hand it back. It slows things down. You use some of the words that the other person has just said, and you're letting them know that you heard what they said. Pardon?
Active listening?
Well, some people call that active listening, and some people call that respect. But I don't think it's drilling down enough to say, what's the actual skill, and what does it look like, and can I practice it, and can I measure it, so that I know I'm doing it. So,
Involves respect.
yeah.
Because you're listening.
So we're going to try this out. Same thing. You're going to work with somebody, but this time you're going to face them. And they're going to talk about a topic. It's not going to be pizza. They're going to talk about a topic. This time, you can only either reflect or use an open question. So really push yourself to only reflect and use an open question. We're not going to self-disclose. You're not going to summarize or give them advice. You're going to ask an open question or you're going to reflect. So face each other. And your topic is snow. So we're going to stop our snow conversations. flowers? So your interview skills took it into a deeper kind of area. Yeah. Okay, so how was that for the snow talkers this time?
That was good.
You had someone.
Interested in how I felt about snow.
So, so that person seemed interested in what you had to say.
Yeah.
And what was the result of that for you?
Felt good. I felt listened to. I felt heard.
Any other comments from the snow talkers?
I learned about things that I
Oh yeah,
didn't
sorry, we're
realize.
supposed to bring.
Yeah, sorry.
Whoops.
I didn't know what was in my brain about snow until my mouth opened.
So you discovered you knew more about snow.
Yeah,
Than
and
you did
my
before you
experience
started
with
talking
snow,
about
and I
snow.
connected it to, going to university. And so it was, because I went from Vancouver to Toronto, back when Toronto was colder. And so it just opened up a whole other thing.
Great. You never know where it's going to take you. Any other snow talker comments about this exercise? Any comments from the speakers?
The open-ended and reflective questions kind of made me feel like she's genuinely interested in what I'm talking about. Oh. Sorry. And we ended up actually, I wanted to know more about her, so I felt very connected because of that conversation, because of the open-ended.
So the open-ended and the reflection caused you to feel that she was interested in you, and it created a mutuality.
Exactly.
So that you then became interested in her.
Exactly.
Which is not where we're necessarily going to go
That's okay.
when we're doing prior learning, except we did hear this morning about the importance of some degree of self-disclosure.
Right.
Okay? Because this morning Neil talked about how important it sometimes is to say, I've had an experience like that too. Not to just parrot them, but to actually create permission if I've had a struggle with that too, and this is where I went with that, so that there's permission for that person to talk maybe more openly about something that was a struggle for them. Any comments from the people who were using open questions and reflecting in that discussion? Mike, sorry.
Well, as opposed to the previous exercise, it was kind of nice to see the body language and the facial expressions and help me get more actively involved in the questioning and think about the questions I was asking, because I could see the face and that sort of thing.
I found it hard. Initially I was like, okay, I'm on track, and then I had this closed-ended question in my head and I couldn't get it out, and I couldn't find a way in my head to put it into an open-ended one, and I found that it actually distracted me from listening to her. So I was saying to her, I think of myself as a pretty good listener, but that was challenging for me. Yeah.
I was trying to help her.
Yeah, she was trying to help me how to rephrase it into something open-ended. Yeah.
I couldn't think of it either, so.
I think it happened the same to us, right here.
Yeah, same here. Like, I thought I was a good listener, and I guess I'm not. Or maybe I am. I'm just not good at asking open-ended questions when it's something not that relevant. I mean, it's like snow, so I find it challenging when it's something so, kind of meaningless, it comes from nowhere. Maybe if it was something more personal, then I will be better. I want to think I will be better.
There's another comment here. I'll take it.
I noticed that the reflection back came really easier than I expected, and it gave me time to think, because I could just repeat part of what she said, and it gave me a second or two to think about an open-ended question, perhaps, to move the conversation along. But I did also find that my partner was very forthcoming, and so there weren't a lot of questions left to ask that I could think of anyway.
Right. So I want to make a comment, and then I want to actually, was there another, yeah, I want to ask Rebekah to comment on this too. So the comment about the noticing that since the rule was don't ask an open question, that when you wanted to ask an open question and you notice that, then you're kind of thinking, okay, now I want to try to turn this into an open question. I would say is a really good skill, because that means you're paying attention to yourself in the moment and considering in advance what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And I think that's a really, really high-level skill for an interviewer, that you're turned on in the moment, you're self-watching while you're preparing to speak. So that's a really important skill. And yes, it's a challenge to really work and notice how infrequently we are inclined to ask a more open question than a closed question. But sometimes we say something and think later, wow, I wish I'd said that differently. Just notice it, right? We all do and say things lots of times every day that we think, well, I think I might have done that differently. Just notice. And if we pay attention to ourselves, then we can make different decisions if we want as time goes on. So to be able to notice that was just really great. And your comment about the pause, again, that's another thing that has to do with, if we're taking it easy and both myself and the person I'm interviewing have some time to kind of explore, I'm being mindful of how I'm present with that person and using my skills. That person has some time to think about what they're saying. We're both in a state where we can be more, I hate to use the word respectful because it's such an open word, but it is a respectful place to be. One of the things that Rebekah and I were talking about, I'm going to ask you to talk about this too, because you said such great things about it, and that is that when we think about biases, whether the interview initially hasn't got a kind of responsive interviewer, or whether we do have a responsive interview or a relational interview, in the end, the assessor has got to be paid attention to biases. There's no way to, well, of course we can ignore that, but we're saying not to ignore that. We're saying that's a big part of how we conduct interviews and how we assess. Anyway, and that's another particular skill. I just want to hand it to you on that one.
Okay, so I think I talked a little bit about biases when I was saying that we have a little, I'll put that down. I think they're both on, that's probably why. On our structured interview, we have a spot there for biases, and we encourage the assessors to read over that all the time. Just to be mindful of it, because when you think about it, everything that we do with our own lens. We do with whoever it is, and from their own experience, right? So when I do an interview, if I'm doing an interview, I'm doing it based on where I'm from, who I am, my background, my education, my life experience. It's coming from. I have no choice but to deliver it that way. And we all have biases. We don't like to talk about our biases. We don't like to, if I asked everyone right now to pick a bias. Everyone would pick something safe, like, I don't like McDonald's, I like going to Wendy's, or something, because we don't really want to put our biases out there. So if we try to act like we don't have biases, and sometimes we actually could do a disservice to either our clients or the people that we're interviewing or to other people, because we all have biases. And sometimes if we think that we don't, then we may not actually see the person. And I was talking about an activity that I do sometimes about building rapport with people that are different. An activity of people when they're in a room and they don't know anybody, and I usually ask them to go around, find someone they don't know, and start a conversation, find 3 things in common, but they can't be obvious. So I can't say, oh, we both have curly hair. It has to be something really different. You have to ask a question and try to get to know the individual. And then after they're digging and digging and digging for 3, sometimes they find 5, sometimes they find 10, sometimes they just have a conversation. And it might not be someone that they normally would have spoke to initially. Right? But when you think about that, you have natural rapport with some people than you do others, right? And sometimes when you build natural rapport with some people, it actually excludes people as well, right? So sometimes that's another thing that we kind of have to be mindful of. Sometimes it does take an effort to build a relationship or to make a relationship. Sometimes it's just a conversation.
I'd like to ask this again, the snow talkers, the people who were talking about snow, and I do not want you to answer this. I actually just want you to think about it and allow yourself to just go with it in your thought, but I'm not going to ask you to disclose it. When you were talking about snow, was there anything about your social location, gender, race, sexual orientation, an experience of poverty or privilege of not being in poverty, background of some mental health challenges, anything that you might, that is related in your life that has to do with snow? Don't want you to answer it. I just want you to think about, is there something in your social location that you might have ended up discussing in relation to snow, had there been the space or time or comfortability to say that? And I just want to see a show of hands. Okay, no, that's fine. And now I'd like you to think about that. All of you can think about that. Oh, actually, maybe there were some interviewers who had there been a longer time, or maybe you were thinking that you have your own relationship with snow, and it has a social, cultural piece to it, that had there been more time and comfortability, that you might have gone there in your conversation. Anybody? Okay. So, can you think about what it would take for your interviewer to create the space for you to go there? What are the things that you'd need from the person who's speaking with you for you to be able to talk about that?
I feel it depends a lot on your style.
On your style?
Yeah, on your, like the person, well, are you asking about the interviewer or the person being?
Well, I'm asking, what does it take in an interview
Yeah.
for the person who's being interviewed
Mhm.
to go to some of those places that cause a little more self-disclosure of some more,
Depends on how
uncomfortable
good you
things
are
to
with
talk about.
boundaries. I don't have a lot of boundaries, and so it takes me about this long to go from this to more intimate. But for others, they never go there. So I think it does have a lot to do with your own sense of what's private and what isn't.
So for you, that would be easier for you.
Pretty easy. Too easy sometimes.
You had your hand up.
I think that it would also depend on the skills of the interviewer in terms of how quickly they pick up on maybe some cues that you would disclose more if they probed. So,
And can you say what that skill is? Just what might somebody say to you that would?
I'm not sure if it's empathy. No, I don't think empathy is the right word. So if I gave them a hint, and they picked up on that hint or that clue, what would that
look like or
Reception?
sound like?
I guess reflecting back with an additional piece.
So reflection.
Reflection,
Might be one of
yes.
those things for you. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I don't know what the skill would be, but it's like you said, building rapport with the person that you're interviewing, building confidence, and making sure that the interviewee is in a safe, comfortable environment where they can disclose the information and not feel judged and not regret it later, and confidence that everything is confidential as well. I think we touched on it in the early session this morning.
So one specific skill is to actually say that this is a confidential conversation. Yeah. And what are those other building confidence things?
Building, I guess.
Really specific. What could somebody say or do that might support the building of confidence?
You know when it's there, but you just can't find the word for it. I think I was going to use the same word as empathy, just so that you recognize, or the person can recognize that they are understanding and that there are some cultural differences or what have you. So,
Would you name those?
Cultural differences? No. Yeah.
We should call this the workshop about the things that cannot be named.
I would say openness, but I don't mean openness in sharing my stuff, which
Right.
is inappropriate, but I mean an openness in stance, looking directly at the individual, leaning in, that kind of openness, paying attention to what the person is saying.
So body language is a good way to demonstrate openness. Any other thoughts or comments about this?
Question?
And there's a hand up over here. Yeah.
Maybe go to them because I talk more.
I was going to use the word sincerity. If you can have a conversation with somebody, empathy is a word, but I don't need in an interview situation for someone else to be empathetic to my situation. I need sincerity in terms of they really want to know the answer to that question. So as part of it is the tone of the person asking the question. Instead of having pulled that open-ended question from page 23 of the open-handed handbook, question handbook, and I've heard many people ask open-ended questions that are like, you clearly don't want to know the answer to this one. You say the question well phrased, but you're not sincere in really wanting to know that. And so there's an emotional relationship you develop, but I think that sincerity of really wanting the answer and demonstrating that through your tone, through your body language or whatever, that's the important thing for me to disclose further.
Do you remember your question?
It was a question. Okay. Actually, it was a question for your style of interviewing, and that is, I worked under someone who was very good at keeping a poker face, and I got nervous and was twittery and crazy in a way that I wasn't with other people because I was so freaked out that I couldn't read him at all. So what do you do with, I know it's over the phone, so it's a little different, but what do you do about that? That's like, it's disconcerting when someone's not reacting at all to you.
I don't know, speaking to that, I have the mic on. So what we try to do when a candidate's assigned to an assessor, they have each other's, they're connected right away. So they usually email each other. If I ever do a primary, I always have a conversation with the person first. So when we're even setting up the time for the interview, I usually call them and I let them know, when we're actually on the call, I won't be able to repeat anything, but just talk about what it is that you do every day. I'm not going to be able to give you feedback. So I do kind of prepare them beforehand. And I encourage all the other assessors to do that as well, because we are people too, right? Yeah. We just can't stray from the script because it's a certification that they're actually getting. So they're actually getting a designation after their name. So it's a CCDP is their designation after they go through the certification process. So that has to be that way. But at the same time, we all work in the helping profession. We like to work with people. So you don't ever want to make people feel like that. So I always make sure I set all my interviews up by phone, and I let them know, they usually will say how long, and I say, usually it takes, you have up to 2 hours. The average is hour 15, hour and a half, but take as much time as you need. And talk more than less. Because if I have enough, I'm going to jump in and say thank you. And that's what I encourage all the assessors to do when people are talking too much or we're rambling, but you have enough information to do your scoring. I just tell them to jump in and say thank you. And I tell them that too. If I jump in and say thank you, we're moving to the next question. Yeah, I'm not being rude, but it may happen. I might just jump in. And it might be when you breathe. So I usually try to give them, I usually do try to give them enough information so that you don't want them to feel more nervous than what they already are, because they already don't know what you're going to ask. And we have a couple of different interviews, so even if they talk to a coworker and they said, they're going to ask you this and they're going to ask you that, we may not ask that question. It might be a different question, but we're still looking for the same competencies. So you don't want people to be nervous. So I try to make them feel at ease beforehand, and I let them know it's going to be recorded, and I tell them I'm going to read the script again and remind them that I can't give feedback, but I will jump in when you're breathing and say thank you, so we can move on if that happens.
Is there a debrief opportunity in another conversation?
No, because once I go through my process and I send it to the registrar, then that person will send it to another assessor for a second listen. So I score it independently, and I send the recording and my paperwork to the registrar, and then they don't see my scores like the other assessor. They just get the recording, and then they score it independently. Now, the registrar can give feedback to the individual because I mark feedback. So if there's something, say if somebody they were weak on career theory, I might say, individual could benefit from, or if they identified, I'm not that strong in career theory, then I would say individual identified, maybe some career theory workshops or books. So I'll put things on like that.
So it can still be a learning opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things. The other thing that's kind of neat about the process is we did actually, Phil and I, so Phil's, I seen him kind of coming in and out, but we went through the whole process in the candidate's guide and used the CAPLA manual to kind of develop any possible action plan. So there is a whole new learning management system that the Nova Scotia Career Development Association is getting. So we kind of went through and said, oh yeah, no, we're great here, we're great here. Oh, we should probably do a little bit of work around this. And, you know, maybe there should be this piece that actually goes back, like a type of form, a report card that actually goes back from all three pieces for the individual. They know what their scores are in terms of the exam. The work experience is just to demonstrate that they have the 3 years minimum experience or the 5,400 hours required to go through the process. And then, but there's not a whole lot of feedback on the structured interview. So this would be, so one of the things that would have came out of going through the whole quality assurance manual is to kind of come up with some sort of a thing where there is actual, everyone's going to kind of get the same type of report card with their own individual feedback on it.
Do we have time for that really quick last thing, or what do you think?
You guys will like it.
Because, you know, we can also do it by just having one story and everybody brainstorm instead of in groups.
Okay, we could do it. Want me?
In a group.
Okay, want me to do it?
So let's add reflection to reframing. And we're going to hear, okay, you want to tell this fishing story?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to hear someone tell us a story about something that they did that didn't actually turn out exactly, a little harder than they thought. It didn't turn out exactly the way they planned it. We're going to hear the story, and then we're going to do some reflection plus reframing.
So what I want you to also do when I do this is, or when I talk, is I want you to write down on a piece of paper if you hear anything that stands out in the story, if you hear any type of different skills or abilities or knowledge that might come out in this activity, right? So I go fishing, right? I go mackerel fishing. I'll be very specific. So one of my coworkers, they used to go fishing all the time, and I would help supervise some of these adventure camps with kids. So I took a bunch of kids deep sea fishing, and then I also went fishing with this individual all the time. And he would give me, you know, the stick thing with the string on it, with the little hook on it, and then he'd show me how to, you know, throw it out there into the water, and then I would, you know, wheel the thing in and do that over and over again. And it was great because it was mackerel. So mackerel's really easy to catch, right? Like, it's like they jump right on the line. So I did this a couple of times, and every time I would get a fish, I'd bring it over and, you know, let my coworker take it off the hook, and that was kind of my fishing excursion. One time I go and we bring a bunch of kids, so 12 kids, and we're fishing cliffside at a place called Shads Bay in Nova Scotia. So every time I would get a fish, my coworker would be busy with the kids trying to help them with their fish. So then I had to learn how to take the fish off the hook, right? Then I'm casting, you know, my rod or my line, and then sometimes maybe my lures would get hooked on the bottom, so that I would lose them. So then I had to, you know, if my coworker was busy, I had to go to the tackle box and get the lures and put them on. And then I might realize, okay, I'm casting, it's not going where I want it to go, so the weight, I need more weight, so I'd have to add more weight to my line. And then I started noticing different places where other people would fish, and I would go down there and I would start to you know, fish in these other areas. And it was me and another coworker, so I always went with someone else because I always like to have someone else to talk to, but I always like talking to all the other people that were down there fishing as well, right? So then it got to the point where some of my friends wanted to go because I was going all the time. Like, there was one night I think I caught like 51 mackerel in like 2 hours, and I would be right there in the Eastern Passage, and I'd, you know, either cut them or clean them or fish them back, throw them back, or do whatever. But it was almost like a social thing. Like, it was evenings, it was getting dark, we're still out there fishing. So then what I started to do was check the tides, because sometimes it was really good. So if it was low tide or high tide, so either you want to catch the fish when they're coming in or catch the fish when they're going out. So I would check the tide before I would go, and I would plan my trips around the tide. So for something that I would have started initially, when you think about it, I didn't know what I was doing with the rod. I have my own rods now. I usually have like at least 3 or 4 rods in my car. If I go to places like Cape Breton, I usually stop off at this wharf and do some fishing there before I even go to my grandparents. So I mackerel fish all the time. But when I first started, I didn't know what I was doing, but you could probably see from the story how I would have developed that skill, right? In terms of fishing. Like, I changed my own line. I'll say, oh, I'll buy a new rod, and I'll be like, oh no, I don't like that. I'll go to the store, the hobby store, and I'll get brand new like spider wire or spider line or whatever. So I think I'm a pretty good mackerel fisher now.
All right. You heard some skills in there. You heard some knowledge base in there. What kind of a learner is Rebekah? Pardon?
Experiential.
An experiential learner, right. And so what are some things that you could say that would be both a reflection and also a reframing of her story that would give her some feedback about a skill that she just demonstrated for us in that story? Yep.
Even though you had some really miserable days fishing at the beginning, you turned yourself into an expert fisherman, and people turn to you for advice now.
Thank you. Okay. Any other? There's lots. Anything else you could say to Rebekah that's both a reflection and also a reframing of what she told us vis-a-vis a skill? Pardon?
I noticed the language.
Yeah?
Yeah, the language you were using at the beginning is like this thing and that thing and the stick and the, like throwing. And at the end, you also learn the language and you also learn how to buy the equipment. I mean, you knew, right?
Really good reflection, noticing the progression of doing something without language and then turning it into something with language to match the thing that she was doing. Yep. Anything else?
I've done this activity with clients, whether we call it storytelling, right? So, I've even seen people do it with individuals or in groups. So, and this is part of the portfolio program that we do is we get them to tell stories, and once they tell a number of different stories, there'll be certain skills that'll come out in every single story, right? So one of the things that would always come out in all my stories would probably be something around communication or something around people, because I don't go fishing by myself. I like to work with people. Almost everything I do, I'm usually doing with someone else, unless I'm watching TV, and then that's still my company. But in every story, depending on the story, whether it's a hobby or an experience or a skill, there'll be certain skills that are coming out in every single story. Sometimes when you use storytelling with clients or you even ask them to tell you a story, they might come in and they might tell you a story. It might sound positive, it might sound negative. But then as you're listening to the story and you're identifying some of their skills and then you bring that to their attention, that could even change the way that they walk out of your office or walk out after having a conversation. They may not realize how much skills they actually have from one experience. So.
Before we wrap up, any more feedback to give to Rebekah? Because I have two. So Rebekah, I really liked your story about figuring out how to experiment with the lures, and you were experimenting with the tides, and I think that's a really good example of problem solving. And the fact that you told it in that way, I think it's a really good example of your confidence, actually, in being able to problem solve by trial and error. Because that's kind of hard to make a mistake and then solve your mistake by problem solving, and I think you've got some good skills in that area.
Thank you. Thank you.
Last thoughts or comments on this extremely short workshop?
Didn't I tell you it was going to be exciting, though?
Have a great rest of your evening and tomorrow.